Alice had always known she was different from the rest of her family. Not in an obvious, dramatic way. She wasn't the rebellious daughter or the black sheep who had severed ties and never looked back. No, her exclusion was subtler, almost insidious. She was the successful one, the pragmatic one. The one who had left their small-town bubble behind and built a life elsewhere. She had done everything right, excelled in school, landed a high-paying job, traveled the world, but in her family's eyes, that only made her an outsider. They never said it outright, but she felt it in the way conversations grew stilted when she talked about her career, how invitations to family gatherings always seemed like an afterthought, how her brother Todd, the golden boy, was endlessly celebrated despite his string of failures. And yet, despite everything, she still tried. It was an old habit, this need to belong. So when she heard whispers about a grand event at the family estate, she had assumed, naively, that she would be included. It was only when a distant cousin tagged her in a post, a seemingly innocent group photo of everyone dressed in their finest, standing beneath the grand chandelier in the estate's dining hall, that she realized the truth. It had already happened. They hadn't even bothered to tell her. She stared at the screen, her heartbeat sluggish, as if her body hadn't quite processed the betrayal yet. The caption read, "An unforgettable night with family. So much love in this room, so much love, indeed." The comments were filled with adoration, "So beautiful, wish I could have been there." And one that caught her eye finally. A proper reunion, just like old times. Just like old times. The message was clear. Alice was never meant to be part of this. A slow, creeping numbness spread through her. Then a sharper sting of anger. She scrolled through the faces, all smiling, all unaware of the storm brewing inside her. Her mother looking radiant in a deep green dress. Her father holding a glass of whiskey, laughing with an uncle she hadn't seen in years. Todd, of course, at the center of it all, grinning like he owned the world. It wasn't the exclusion itself that hurt the most. It was the finality of it. This was no accident, no last-minute decision. They had planned it, orchestrated it, made sure she wouldn't be there. She took a deep breath, pressing the phone to her palm so tightly that the edges bit into her skin. The urge to call someone, to demand an explanation, flared up, but she swallowed it down. What would they even say? "Oh, we figured you'd be too busy." "Oh, we didn't think you'd want to come." Lies, all of it. The truth was, they had made their choice. And now she would make hers. Alice stood up, her mind already racing. There was no sadness now, no longing. Only cold, calculating clarity. If they wanted to pretend she didn't exist, fine. But she would make sure that the next time they thought of her, it wouldn't be as the forgotten daughter. It would be as the one who changed everything. Alice didn't say anything. Not to her mother. Not to her brother. Not to anyone who had so effortlessly erased her from that evening. She sat with the knowledge like a smooth stone in her palm, turning it over, examining it from every angle. The first wave of anger had passed, replaced by something colder, sharper. It wasn't just about the party. It was the culmination of years of being sidelined, of subtle dismissals disguised as forgetfulness. This was deliberate. And that meant she had a choice. She could confront them, demand an explanation, insist that she had the right to be included. Or she could do something else entirely. The opportunity presented itself sooner than she expected. A few days later, her mother called, her voice bright and airy, as if nothing had happened. "Sweetheart, how have you been? We haven't heard from you in ages." A lie, of course. They had made sure they wouldn't hear from her. Alice leaned back in her chair, her fingers tightening around her phone. "Busy," she replied evenly. "Work's been crazy. You know how it is." Her mother sighed. The kind of long-suffering sound that suggested Alice was the one who had made things difficult. "Well, we were just talking about you the other night. Todd had the most wonderful idea. He thinks you should come home more often. You know, reconnect with everyone." Alice almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Reconnecting? After they had intentionally excluded her from the biggest family gathering in years? Oh, they were good. They wanted her to play her part distant but obedient, successful but never disruptive. She decided to test the waters. Oh? When exactly were you talking about me? There was a brief hesitation. Oh, just recently. Alice smiled to herself. Coward. At the party. A silence stretched out just long enough to confirm everything. Then, a carefully measured response. What party? There it was. Not even a flinch, not even an ounce of hesitation in her mother's voice. They had already prepared for this moment. They had anticipated that she might find out, and instead of offering some weak excuse, they had chosen to lie straight to her face. Alice tilted her head, staring out the window. The one at the estate. Looked like quite the event. Her mother's voice turned just a shade too light. Oh, that! That was just a little thing. Really nothing special. Just a few people dropping by. A little thing. A private chef, a string quartet, a guest list carefully curated to exclude her. A few people that somehow included everyone except her. Right, Alice murmured. Just a small get-together, exactly, her mother said. Her relief palpable. Honestly, you didn't miss much. Alice resisted the urge to press further. What would be the point? They had already shown their hand. They wanted her at arm's length, useful but not present. It was a game they had played for years, but this time they had overplayed it. Oh well, Alice said, keeping her voice light. I guess I'll have to make it up to everyone next time. Of course, darling, her mother chirped. We'll plan something soon. Alice hummed in agreement. Then, just before hanging up, she added, Actually, I might be coming back to town sooner than you think. A bit of business to handle. You know how it is. Her mother hesitated for a fraction of a second, then smoothed over her surprise. That's wonderful. We'd love to see you. Would they? Alice doubted that. But they would see her, one way or another. She was done waiting for their approval, done trying to fit into a space they had never intended for her. If they wanted her to be an outsider, then she would be one completely. And this time, they wouldn't like what that meant. Alice didn't return home right away. That would have been predictable. Instead, she spent the next week preparing. Not for a confrontation. Confrontations could be dismissed, waved off with excuses, smoothed over with practiced lies. No, what she was planning required patience. Subtlety. Precision. She started with information. Years of being the overlooked one had granted her a unique advantage. People tended to forget she was there, which meant they spoke freely in front of her. They underestimated what she remembered, and Alice remembered everything. She reached out to an old acquaintance, someone her family had long dismissed as irrelevant. Eleanor Vance had once been her grandfather's lawyer, a sharp, meticulous woman who had handled the family's estate matters before being quietly pushed aside in favor of a more agreeable firm. Alice had always liked Eleanor. She had the kind of mind that saw through pretense, the kind that found satisfaction in the meticulous unraveling of paperwork and loopholes. Eleanor remembered Alice, too. And more importantly, she remembered the estate. Your grandfather was a stubborn man, Eleanor said over coffee, flipping through files with practiced efficiency. He never trusted your father to handle things properly. That's why, technically, the estate is still in a holding trust. Alice raised an eyebrow. Meaning the transfer to your parents was never finalized. They've lived in that house for years under the assumption that it would eventually be theirs. But legally? That's still up for debate. Alice leaned back in her chair, considering. She had expected something useful, but this was gold. Her parents had thrown that party as if they were lords of the manor, dismissing her as if she were an outsider. But in reality, they weren't even the rightful owners of the place they so desperately clung to. She smiled. So what would it take to challenge that assumption? Eleanor looked at her over the rim of her glasses. A well-placed request for review. Just enough to shake things up. Are you sure you want to do this? Alice thought about the party, about the lies, about the casual cruelty of erasing her existence. Then she nodded. Yes. The request was filed within days. A quiet, formal inquiry into the status of the estate, sent through the proper channels, with no immediate disruption yet. Alice didn't want to tip them off too soon. She wanted them to feel safe, to think everything was as they had left it. Then she made her next move. Her family thrived on reputation. They valued appearances above all else, the illusion of unity, of effortless wealth and tradition. But Alice had spent years observing the cracks in that illusion. Her brother Todd, for instance, had always been their golden child. But he had one fatal flaw: he was careless. And carelessness, when properly exploited, could be devastating. She started small. A discreet inquiry into his latest business venture, the one their father had invested heavily in. She didn't have to dig far to find the issue's overstated projections, poor financial planning, a reliance on family name rather than actual competence. It wasn't failing yet, but it was on the edge, and Alice knew exactly how to give it a little push. A well-placed tip to the right investor, a quiet suggestion that the numbers weren't quite what they seemed. Just enough doubt to make someone pull back, to trigger a domino effect of hesitation. The moment Todd started losing financial backing, the moment cracks began to form in his perfect world, Alice knew the panic would set in. And when Todd panicked, he made mistakes. She watched it unfold with the kind of satisfaction that came from knowing she wasn't just reacting, she was controlling the game now. The first phone call from her mother came late at night, her voice strained but attempting nonchalance. "Alice, darling, Todd's business is going through a rough patch. Just a temporary thing. But, well, you know finance. Do you happen to know anyone who could, reassure investors?" Alice smiled, tracing the rim of her glass with one finger. "Oh, I don't know, Mother. You said it yourself, I've been so busy. I wouldn't want to interfere." A pause. "Well, of course. But we're family, Alice. We help each other, family." That word again, thrown around only when it was convenient. She let the silence stretch before replying, her voice light. "I'm sure Todd will figure it out. He always does." She could almost hear her mother's frustration through the phone. "You should really come home, sweetheart. We've been talking about how nice it would be to have everyone together again." Alice glanced at her calendar. "Funny, that wasn't the case a few weeks ago, Alice." "I'll think about it," she interrupted smoothly, then ended the call before her mother could say anything else. She would go back, eventually. But not on their terms, not as the forgotten daughter begging for inclusion. She would return as the one holding all the cards. Alice returned home 3 weeks later. Not in a rush, not with demands or questions, but with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were walking into. The estate looked the same, grand, imposing, a monument to the family's carefully curated legacy. But Alice saw it differently now. It wasn't theirs. It was borrowed, a house of cards standing only because no one had dared to test its foundation. Until now. She didn't announce her arrival. Instead, she stepped inside like she belonged because legally she did. The staff hesitated at first, unsure whether to greet her or pretend she wasn't there, but she offered them the same cool detachment her family had given her for years. Let them wonder. Let them feel the shift before they understood what it meant. Her mother was the first to notice. She was coming down the grand staircase, pearls draped around her neck, her dress crisp and perfectly fitted, the image of effortless control. Until she saw Alice. Alice, the surprise was genuine. "What are you doing here?" Alice smiled. "I figured it was time for a visit, family and all that." Her mother recovered quickly, slipping into hostess mode. "Oh, of course. You should have told us. We would have planned another event without me." Alice's voice was mild. But the words landed. Her mother flinched, just barely, but covered it with a forced chuckle. "Darling, don't be dramatic. It was just a small thing." Alice tilted her head, pretending to consider that. "Right. Just a few people. A private chef. A live quartet. Very casual." Her mother's lips pressed together, but before she could speak, Todd's voice echoed from down the hall. Oh great, she's back. He walked in looking worse than usual, stressed, on edge, the carefully composed arrogance fraying at the edges. Alice took a seat, unhurried, watching him. You look tired, Todd. He scoffed. And you look exactly like someone who's about to be a pain in my ass. Their father entered a moment later, barely masking his irritation. Alice, this is unexpected. Alice folded her hands in her lap. Is it? Silence. Her father gave her a sharp look, assessing, and she saw the first flicker of unease. He was realizing what her presence meant. You should have told us you were coming, he said, as if that changed anything. Would you have told me about the party? More silence. Then her mother sighed, exasperated. Alice, must we really dwell on this? You weren't here, and that's all there is to it. Alice smiled. Oh, I agree. It's done. What matters now is what happens next. Her father's eyes narrowed. And what exactly does that mean? Alice leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice light. Well, I was speaking with Eleanor Vance recently. Remember her? She was handling grandfather's estate before you replaced her. The tension in the room spiked. Her father's fingers tightened around the arm of his chair. What does Eleanor have to do with anything? Alice let the pause stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then she said it. Apparently, the estate isn't officially yours. Grandfather never finalized the transfer. The reaction was immediate. Her mother stiffened. Todd shot her a sharp look, suspicion and panic flickering across his face. And her father went completely still. That's ridiculous, he said. Is it? Alice shrugged. The records say otherwise. And since it hasn't been legally transferred, that means all heirs have equal claim to it. She let that sink in before adding, including me. Her mother was the first to recover. This is absurd. You wouldn't. Alice tilted her head. Wouldn't what? Her father exhaled sharply, forcing himself to remain calm. What do you want? That was the question, wasn't it? They thought she wanted revenge. That she wanted to humiliate them, ruin them, burn everything down just for the satisfaction of watching it collapse. But Alice wasn't interested in destruction. She wanted control. I want my share, she said simply. Legal, formal, undisputed. My name on the estate. My say in what happens to it. Todd laughed, short and bitter. You think you can just walk in here and make demands? Alice met his gaze without blinking. You think I can't? Todd opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't have an answer for that. Their father rubbed a hand over his face, calculating shifting tactics. Alice, be reasonable. This house has always been part of our legacy. Alice raised an eyebrow. Then maybe you should have invited me to the celebration of that legacy. Silence. Her mother inhaled sharply. You're being petty, no, Alice said, standing. I'm being practical. She turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. You have a few days to consider your options. But let's be clear, I'm not asking for permission. I'm stating a fact, things are changing, whether you like it or not. Then she walked out, leaving them in the house they no longer had the right to claim as their own. The calls started the next morning. First from her mother, a strained attempt at diplomacy wrapped in condescension. Alice, darling, let's not be rash about this. There's no need to involve lawyers in family matters. Alice listened in silence, letting her mother fill the space with empty reassurances and veiled warnings. When there was finally a pause, she said, Then you should have thought of that before you decided I wasn't part of the family. Her mother inhaled sharply. This is different. No, Alice corrected. This is exactly the same. Then she hung up. An hour later, Todd tried. His approach was different, anger barely restrained, words sharp with frustration. You don't even want the house, he snapped. You live in a city you actually like, you've never cared about this place, so what the hell are you trying to prove? Alice leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Maybe I changed my mind. Cut the crap. You first. A tense silence crackled between them. Then Todd exhaled, trying to reel himself back in. You're making this complicated for no reason. Alice almost laughed. No reason? She had plenty of reasons. But she wasn't going to waste them on him. You should focus on your own complications, Todd. I hear investors are pulling out of your company. His sharp intake of breath was satisfying. See you soon, she said, and ended the call. She expected her father to be the last to break, but instead it was the lawyers who reached out first. A formal email, carefully worded, but unmistakably urgent. A request for a discussion regarding the estate, phrased as if it were a polite invitation rather than an attempt to rein her in before things spiraled further. Alice didn't respond immediately. She let them wait. Let the uncertainty linger. Let them wonder how far she was willing to take this. It wasn't about the house. It had never been about the house. It was about the lesson. By the third day, the cracks in their resolve had widened. She received an unexpected visit from her father, of all people. She found him standing outside her apartment building, looking as out of place as a king without his throne. You're not answering my calls, he said. You didn't answer mine for years, Alice replied, stepping past him toward the entrance. Alice's voice carried weight, the same authoritative tone that had once made her flinch as a child. Now, it barely made her pause. Let's talk. She considered him for a moment before nodding. Fine. But not here. She led him to a cafe down the street, deliberately choosing a public place where his temper would be forced into civility. He hated being anywhere that made him seem ordinary. She took some satisfaction in watching him sit stiffly in a chair that was too small for the presence he liked to command. He didn't waste time. You've made your point. You're upset. But this is childish. Alice stirred her coffee, unbothered. No. Childish would have been showing up to your party and throwing a scene. This is adult. This is legal. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. What do you want, Alice? Really? She studied him, this man who had always seen her as an extension of inconvenience rather than a person. I want you to acknowledge what you did. Her father's jaw tightened. And what, exactly, did I do? You cut me out, Alice said, her voice steady. Not just from a party, but from everything. You spent years making sure I was just close enough to be useful but never close enough to belong. That's ridiculous, he muttered. Is it? She tilted her head. Name the last time you asked me about my life. The last time you invited me to something without me having to hear about it secondhand. He said nothing. Alice leaned back, satisfied. That's what I thought. Her father exhaled sharply, shoulders sagging just slightly. Fine. You're right. We should have included you. The words were forced, unwilling. So now what? You hold the estate hostage until we grovel. Alice smiled. Oh no, I have bigger plans than that. For the first time, she saw real unease flicker in his expression. Good. Let them wonder. Let them feel, for once, what it was like to not know what came next. Alice arrived at the estate 3 days later, exactly at noon, as requested. Not by them, no, she hadn't agreed to any of their frantic calls or last-minute attempts to negotiate. She had set the time herself, making sure they knew she wasn't on their schedule anymore. The house looked the same, but the people inside it didn't. Her mother's usual polished elegance had a crack in it. Her father sat rigidly like he was bracing for impact, and Todd looked like he hadn't slept in days. Good. She didn't sit when they gestured to the chairs. Instead, she let them stew in their discomfort, watching them the way they had always watched her, like an unpredictable element they couldn't quite control. Her father was the first to speak. You win, Alice raised an eyebrow. Do I? Her mother sighed dramatically. What more do you want? The house. Fine, we'll sign over your share. Just stop this ridiculous game. Alice almost laughed. They still thought this was about property. She placed a folder on the table and slid it toward them. This isn't just about my share, she said, her voice steady. I'm restructuring ownership. The estate won't belong to you anymore. It will be jointly held, Todd scoffed. Meaning what? Meaning, Alice said, leaning forward, you don't get to use it as your personal kingdom anymore. Every decision, renovation, sales, events will require my approval. No more unchecked spending, no more throwing parties without considering who actually has a right to be there. Her father clenched his jaw. And if we refuse? Alice shrugged. Then the legal review continues. Maybe the courts decide I get more than just a share. Maybe they decide you were never entitled to it at all. Her mother inhaled sharply. You wouldn't. Alice smiled, slow and deliberate. Wouldn't I? For once, they had nothing to say. Todd looked at their father, waiting for him to argue, to threaten, to do something. But the old man had gone quiet. He was calculating, running through every outcome, and realizing finally that Alice had already won. The papers were signed in silence. When it was done, Alice took the documents, stood, and looked at each of them. You wanted to erase me, she said. Now you'll never be able to. Then she walked out, leaving them to sit in the house that was no longer truly theirs. Alice didn't look back as she left the estate. There was nothing there for her anymore, no longing, no resentment, no need for their approval. The moment the papers were signed, the house ceased to be a symbol of exclusion and became something entirely different, proof that she had taken control of her own story. Her mother called once, 2 days later. Alice let it ring. She already knew what it would be, some carefully crafted speech about how they should move forward as a family. It didn't matter. They weren't in control anymore. They couldn't pretend she was invisible, couldn't erase her from the picture whenever it was convenient. Every time they so much as planned a gathering, they would have to acknowledge her name on those documents. Todd tried to fight it, of course. She heard from Eleanor that he had been ranting to the family lawyers, looking for a way out of the agreement. But there wasn't one. He was stuck, just like the rest of them. Alice returned to the city and resumed her life, but something had shifted. She carried herself differently, no longer weighed down by that invisible tether of seeking their acceptance. She met with Eleanor one last time to finalize the transition. As they wrapped up, the older woman smiled at her. Your grandfather would have liked this, she said. He never believed your father had the right to that house. Maybe he was just waiting for someone like you to set things right. Alice didn't know if she had said anything right, but she knew she had set it straight. The estate wasn't hers, not entirely, but it wasn't theirs either, not in the way they had always assumed. That was enough. Weeks passed before her father reached out. Not with an apology, of course. That wasn't his style. Instead, he sent a short, clipped email. We need to discuss the next steps regarding estate management. Alice smiled as she read it. For the first time in her life, her presence wasn't an afterthought. It was a requirement.